The threat of U.S. tariffs has prompted the provincial government to reconsider the construction of oil and gas pipelines.
Expanding Canada's oil and gas infrastructure has long been a contentious topic, but tough tariffs have forced the country to take a closer look at its sovereignty and self-reliance on its own resources.
Canada pushes Trans Mountain Pipeline to sell oil to China. Canada pushes Trans Mountain Pipeline to sell oil to China far beyond U.S. shores. Wary of the U.S. trade war, Canada eyes more oil and gas exports to Asia. Since April 2025, over 4 million barrels of oil per day will vanish from the U.S. market. What is really happening now that the tariff war has officially begun? Starting in April 2025, the Canadian government decided to stop prioritizing crude oil exports to the U.S. Instead, they redirected its entire supply through the Trans Mountain Expansion project to Asian markets. This decision was made as a direct retaliation to the 25% tariff on oil, steel, and lumber imposed in late 2024 by the Trump administration, forcing Ottawa to find a new outlet for its flagship energy product. This reversal of the flow not only disrupted the oil market, but also kicked off a geoeconomic game worth around $1 trillion. It has far-reaching implications for supply chains and global trade balances, while also presenting an opportunity for countries like Russia to weaken NATO in the short term. So what will be the solution to this most intense phase of the tariff war? Let's analyze it right here on Deep State in today's video. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any great content from us. Now let's shift our focus to the Trans Mountain Expansion, a significant development in the energy sector. Starting in May 2024, the Trans Mountain Expansion Upgrade Project officially entered commercial operation after more than 12 years of preparation, with a total investment reaching 34 billion Canadians. Nearly 5 times the initial estimate of 7.4 billion Canadians. This expansion has increased capacity from 300,000 to nearly 900,000 barrels of oil per day, enough to reroute all of Alberta's oil, once bound for the U.S. Gulf Coast, directly to the Pacific Ocean, effectively opening the door to Asia's crude oil market. Instead of flowing to the Gulf Coast ports along the U.S. Gulf of Mexico shoreline spanning 5 southern states, oil from the Trans Mountain Pipeline is now pumped to the West Ridge Marine Terminal in Vancouver. It's ready to be loaded onto vessels bound for Asia as early as May 2024. This decision is not merely about adding another doorway for Canadian energy products, it is a pivotal geoeconomic strategy. As China experiences a boom in heavy crude imports and Russia, along with other smaller markets, scramble for alternative sources, Ottawa is ready to shake hands with its highest demand Asian customers. The sight of oil trains crossing the Fraser Valley before turning toward the port of Vancouver is more than just a transportation scene. It symbolizes a strategic gamble. Canada is betting its entire energy export future on this new route, hoping to reduce the discount on its crude from nearly $13.50 per barrel compared to WTI to under $10. Section: Impact and Trade. With the critical phase of the Trans Mountain Expansion now complete, Canada's oil flow has not only shifted geographically, but also redirected its trade relationship focus from its traditional ties with the United States to a new playing field, the vast Asian market, where energy trade values can reach hundreds of billions of dollars each year. According to TD Securities, Canadian oil production is expected to hit a record high of about 5.3 million barrels per day this year, as producers ramp up output to match TMX's new capacity. The completion of TMX is hugely significant for Alberta because it will substantially increase our province's production, said Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. Before trade tensions escalated, Canada played a central role in supplying crude oil to the U.S., accounting for over 60%, roughly a quarter of its total imports. However, in recent weeks, EIA data show that U.S. crude imports from Canada have fallen to about 3.1 million barrels per day, the lowest in 2 years. This drop has pushed many refineries along the Gulf Coast, which were built to process Alberta's heavy crude, into a shortage of their primary feedstock. As domestic U.S. wells predominantly produce lighter oil, refineries have been forced to reduce throughput or switch to less efficient operational modes, driving up processing costs. The most visible consequence is that gasoline prices in the U.S. have begun to inch upward. According to APR, the average price for a gallon of Aran 87 gasoline is now about $3.15, an increase of roughly 1.8% nationwide as of January 2025. Analysts warned that if the heavy crude shortage persists and tariffs remain in place, gasoline prices in major states like California and Hawaii could exceed $4 per gallon by next fall. Under these new prices, Americans will bear additional burdens as travel costs rise, tightening household budgets. From driving children to school to delivery drivers' routes and weekend getaways, as energy prices climb, the inflationary pressure across the service chain may accelerate, pushing communities into an ever tighter spiral of spending. Since the Trans Mountain Pipeline began flowing oil to Asia in May 2024, the three largest consuming economies, China, India, and Japan, have swiftly signed a series of long-term contracts. This has turned the region into Canada's new home port for crude. According to data from Vortexa, shipments of Alberta heavy crude through TMX to China averaged about 187,000 barrels per day between June and October 2024. Representing nearly 55% of the total volume flowing to Asia. Rangan Petrochemical, the largest private refinery in eastern China, purchased 3 to 7 cargoes per month. This is equivalent to 53,000 to 125,000 barrels per day, filling the gap left by Middle Eastern sour crude. In India, Reliance Industries, the owner of the Jamnagar refinery with a capacity of 1.44 million barrels per day, signed its first deal for 2 million barrels of TMX crude for July 2024 deliveries. This paves the way for imports to scale up to several 100,000 barrels per day in the coming years. This agreement not only diversified Reliance's supply, but also allowed the company to capitalize on a $5 to $6 per barrel discount to Brent, boosting refining margins. In Japan, Enos, the country's leading refiner, and Korea's GS Caltex split a 550,000 barrel Cold Lake shipment, with 250,000 barrels going to Enos for Asia-bound loading in September 2024. This was the first TMX cargo sold to East Asia, cementing Canada's position in the race for heavy crude market share. With these three consuming economies committing nearly 500,000 barrels per day in long-term contracts, analysts estimate that at a Brent price around $75 per barrel, and an average contract duration of 10 years, the total trade value could exceed $1 trillion. This constitutes an indirect declaration of war on Western energy dominance as Canada not only diversifies its outlets, but also challenges the future of the oil flow that has traditionally fueled the U.S. for decades. What do you think about Canada's recent Trans Mountain expansion? Don't hesitate to leave a comment below so we can discuss this issue together on Deep State. Far from forcing Canada to yield, the 2024 tariff package triggered a massive wave of orders from Asia. According to Kepler data, in March 2025, TMX oil exports from Vancouver hit 246,000 barrels per day, a nearly 29% increase from February's 191,000 barrels per day, marking the highest level since the expansion began operating. This surge coincided exactly with the early March imposition of a 10% tariff on Canadian crude by the U.S., showing Asia's market is eager to take discounted oil to offset its energy deficits. The warm cash flow from the east has quickly reached Ottawa. Not only did energy giants like Suncor and Savvis reap significant profits thanks to a $5 to $7 discount per barrel versus Brent, but the federal government also saw a notable rise in tariff and transportation fees. Revenues, rather than scrambling to negotiate to avoid losses, Ottawa has doubled down on infrastructure investments. In the first quarter of 2025, Trans Mountain announced plans to study pump improvements and storage expansion, aiming to lift capacity from 890,000 to over 1 million barrels per day within the next 3 to 5 years. These moves underscore that rather than compelling Canada to concede, Trump's tariffs inadvertently became the catalyst that strengthened Ottawa's energy export lever. As the oil flow transitions from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Canada has not only found new markets but turned pressure into an opportunity to invest long-term in strategic infrastructure. A geoeconomic gamble that makes traditional U.S. allies reliant on cheap oil take a hard look at their stance. As Canada rerouted its heavy crude towards Asia, Russia immediately spotted the gap left in the U.S. market and moved to boost its own exports. Reuters reports that crude shipments from Russia's western ports are set to rise by 100,000 barrels per day to 1.97 million barrels per day in April 2025, despite OPEC plus production cuts, thanks to maintenance completions and exploitation of new markets. Meanwhile, Arctic oil tankers via ship-to-ship transfers delivered over 20 million barrels to China in April 2025 alone, circumventing U.S. sanctions and demonstrating Moscow's flexible energy logistics capabilities. Russia's expansion, however, did not stop. Asia, Beijing and Moscow are strengthening cooperation on the Northern Sea Route, aiming to shorten shipping distances to Asia and reduce reliance on the Suez Canal. As climate warming opens up this seal, Ottawa, for its part, is not standing idly by. The Canadian government is ramping up Arctic security and infrastructure investments, from aerospace radar systems to icebreakers, to safeguard the emerging northern shipping corridor. From this vantage, a northern oil alliance between Russia and Canada is becoming a reality. One side offers massive resources and advanced Arctic extraction, the other provides the Trans-Mountain pipeline straight to the Pacific. Add China, the world's top importer, into the equation and the three countries could form a new oil axis, controlling hundreds of billions of dollars worth of energy flows annually, and forcing NATO to rethink its energy security strategy in the multipolar era. But is this project and strategy so? Since the Trans Mountain expansion's launch, local communities and civil society organizations have vocally opposed it. Environmental groups worry that pipeline expansion will exacerbate Alberta's oil sands extraction, already 6 times more carbon-intensive than conventional crude, and threaten British Columbia's coastal ecosystems. Most critically, First Nations communities have formed an anti-pipeline alliance with at least 3 major lawsuits filed. The Squamish, Salu, and Coldwater First Nations allege that Ottawa ignored traditional land rights and failed to adequately consult them before approving the pipeline across their territories. These cases not only seek injunctions to halt construction permits but also carry court orders forcing Trans Mountain to stop work on contested lands, creating a series of legal bottlenecks that could delay progress by months. Protests have flared along the pipeline corridor, from marches in Kamloops to encampments outside the West Ridge Marine Terminal in Vancouver. Hundreds of Indigenous and environmental volunteers have pitched tents, blocking heavy machinery from entering the forest for days on end. The federal government has had to deploy both Indigenous monitors and environmental observers to oversee the sites, yet public pressure remains high. Absent a clear compromise on benefit sharing and protection of sacred First Nations lands, the risk of further delays or even a project shutdown looms. The question now is whether Ottawa can find a sufficiently strong common voice to diffuse tensions, or if Trans Mountain will stand as a stark example of large infrastructure failure when community rights are overlooked. This is one of the key issues Canada's government must address urgently if it hopes to accelerate its path to future energy autonomy. Through the end of the decade, growth in the crude oil market is signaling a major shift. The International Energy Agency forecasts that global oil demand will peak around 105.6 million barrels per day by 2029, then plateau and enter a slight decline after 2030. The driving forces are the EV revolution and clean energy policies, which could subtract nearly 5 million barrels per day from global demand. In Asia, the target market for Trans Mountain, this green shift is equally underway. China, controlling 60% of global EV market share, targets 1 in 3 vehicles sold to be electric by 2030. India, up from 2.5% EV share in 2024, aims for 30% by the decade's end. As these top energy-consuming economies push hard on EV adoption and higher biofuel blend mandates, OECD oil demand could fall faster than expected. In this context, the 34 billion Canadian dollar Trans Mountain expansion, designed for Alberta's heavy crude, risks becoming an oversized crossing capacity if Asia accelerates its green transition as Europe and North America have. Volumes through this pipeline could plunge post-2030, stranding Canada with excess transport capacity and high maintenance costs without sufficient customers to justify it. This is the long-term dilemma Ottawa must solve if it hopes to avoid rendering Trans Mountain a white elephant amid the global energy revolution. At the start of the year, Brent crude prices have climbed nearly 8%. Moving from around $72 per barrel to $78.05 per barrel by the second week of 2025. This surge has been driven by global supply concerns and, ongoing geopolitical tensions. Brent's rise not only impacts oil importing economies, but also signals a shift in energy logistics networks, with Canada, increasingly dominant in the market. In Europe, deprived of cheap Canadian crude, refiners have turned to higher-cost Middle Eastern and African supplies. Reuters notes that sanctions on Russia and U.S. tariff disruptions have forced Europe to import from these regions, which is really pushing up input costs and squeezing refining margins. Refineries in Germany, Italy, and France report input cost increases of $3 to $5 per barrel since early in the year, putting pressure on domestic fuel prices. At the same time, Maritime flows have been reconfigured, creating bottlenecks at ports. VLCC supertankers from the U.S. Gulf Coast now have to transit via the Panama Canal or around Cape Horn to reach Asia, which is causing congestion at Vancouver and Burnaby ports. VLCC charter rates from the Middle East to China have surged 39% to $37,800 per day, while Afrox voyages from Russia to China have more than doubled. These shifts not only slow delivery schedules but add about $2 to $3 per barrel in logistics costs, directly affecting global retail fuel prices. These successive shocks to Brent prices, rising European import costs, and maritime choke points present fresh challenges to the global supply and demand balance, as Canada exploits its gateway to Asia, alright. Stakeholders, importers and logistics networks alike must recalibrate their strategies, ushering in a volatile geoeconomic era for the energy sector. In summary, Canada's decision to shut the valve on the U.S. market and fling open its doors to Asia was no mere retaliatory move. It sparked a geoeconomic contest worth up to $1 trillion as over 4 million barrels per day reoriented straight into Asian hands. Washington, once confident in Canada's stable supply, now grapples with surging gasoline prices, refinery shortages, and relentless inflationary pressures. Meanwhile, Ottawa has seized a golden opportunity to strengthen infrastructure, inked long-term contracts with China, India, and Japan, and even positioned itself for partnerships with Russia, shaking Western energy order to its core. So, in this grand game of global energy chess, who will turn the tables? Will the U.S. have time to re-drill its stance and compel Canada to reverse course? Or will Ottawa continue dancing between Washington and Beijing, redefining the 21st century oil export map? Be sure to hit subscribe on Deep State so you don't miss any updates on the answer to this question and the latest military, political, and economic news from us.